So one thing which I almost certainly did for you is that I almost certainly gave you a speed reading demonstration. And by the time I give a speed reading demonstration, people look inevitably and think, how is that possible? I do not understand how on earth you can turn pages that fast and actually absorb the stuff. Surely he's got to be cheating. That makes no sense. Now, of course, you'll probably have found that at your school, I would have asked other people to bring textbooks for me so that you could see, no, actually the weird blonde man isn't cheating. He was looking at our work, not something he'd pre-prepared. And so let me just explain how on earth speed reading is possible. It works on a very basic mental principle, which we can think of as mental filtration. The brain likes to filter out obvious things and focus on things which are less obvious. What does that even mean? Well, what it means is that your brain has accumulated a lot of knowledge throughout your life. And it is natural for you to ignore things which your knowledge says is obvious. Like even as you look at me, you're not mentally thinking, oh my word, he's got 2 eyes. I mean, of course not. You take that for granted. Now, of course, you will be focusing on certain things like, oh my word, what a blonde person. Oh my word, what a beautiful silk shirt. You're focusing on things which stand out, which are more different than others. But you do not notice every strand of hair in my head. You don't notice every eyelash I've got. Instead, the brain is saying, what's the overall point here? What is the key concept which is going on? So when I speak about filtering, that's what I mean. Let's ignore the arbitrary little things and get the core. Let's build the core concept. Now, psychologically, this can also be called cognitive and perceptual closure. Cognitive and perceptual closure, which basically means 2 things. One thing, you can be exposed to a portion of information and extrapolate to the whole. I'll use a silly for instance. If I now suddenly let me just hide so you can't, hoo-hoo, I'm hidden. You do not know that I'm here. Ha-ha, I'm gone because you can only see some of me. But of course you're thinking, well, duh, dumbass, I know that you're still there. Just because you're only showing some still doesn't prohibit me from extrapolating to the whole. You can see only my eyes and the top half of my head, but it's enough for you to generalize and say, yes, there's clearly a whole man there. I can do that based on a small bit of information. I can produce the whole bit of information. That's one kind of closure. I mean, for instance, you also assume I've got feet and I've got legs. I haven't shown you that in this video, but you assume it because your previous knowledge of what it is to be a human being and what it is to be a man presupposes that. That's another example of closure. You can see a portion, but your mind can activate previous knowledge so that you can produce a whole. And the opposite is also true in cognitive and perceptual closure. I can give you a lot of information, but your brain is able to take that information and reduce it to a core concept. So let me give you a sentence. If I say, the glorious and mighty Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic when tragically it struck into an iceberg and sunk beneath the cold waters of the ocean to a watery grave. What have I told you? Titanic sank. I've told you Titanic sank. Now you'll notice you've ignored the vast majority of the information. Glorious and mighty, you don't bother saying. Hit an iceberg, you don't necessarily need to say that it was an iceberg. And why is that? It's because you know that the ship was glorious and mighty. You know that it hit an iceberg. You know that it was its maiden voyage. Your previous knowledge allows you to say, you don't have to hold all that stuff. I've got it already. I've got that information. So don't fuss with that to make life more efficient. That was Titanic sank. Now, of course, if someone then said, oh, tell me a bit more about the Titanic sinking, again, your brain can perform this closure and say, well, yeah, it was this huge, amazing ship and it went on the sea for a maiden voyage of all things, and then it hit an iceberg and, oh my way, it was really bad. It sank and like loads of people died and the captain went down with the ship. In other words, your brain not only can reduce, but when called upon to do so, it can expand on the basis of background knowledge. Now, to get a bit fancier, psychologists call that background knowledge your schema or your schemata. That's basically your personal Wikipedia that exists in your mind. And what happens is, anytime you're exposed to data, like, oh, here's a man, your mind compares it to the schemata, and you don't bother saying he's got 2 eyes, he's got a nose, he's got a mouth, he's got ears, but rather you'll focus on things which are a little bit unusual, like, oh, he's a particularly blonde man, or oh yeah, he had blue eyes, or oh, he speaks quite quickly. whatever the case might be, your brain naturally compares incoming information to the previous knowledge that you've stored in your mind so that it can reduce it to the core meaningful concept. Now, you can call that cognitive and in some cases perceptual closure. There's another way of describing it. There was a famous Russian psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky who called this phenomenon compression, mental compression. We take lots of data, but using previous schema or schemata, also a term that Vygotsky used, we can compress it so that you have, Titanic sank, funny blonde man. We always do this. You do this naturally. But the problem is that you've been trained to read in a different way. Instead of you getting the overall point or compressing, like you do if you look at a tree, for instance, you do not notice every single leaf on the tree. You just, there's a pretty tree. It's got a couple of little blooms on it, the sort of pinky kind of color or whatever. Instead of getting that compressed bit of data, which is normal, you've been trained when reading to notice every leaf. And it's in this format. You've been trained to notice every leaf by literally saying all of the words to yourself in your mind. So you literally read, the glorious and mighty Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic when tragically it struck. You've noticed that as you read, you hear a little voice in your mind saying what's written on the page. That voice is called subvocalization. Subconscious vocalization, the voice I don't even think about kind of thing. Now, the problem is subvocalization tends to be very lazy. So as you read, you literally tend to go, the mitochondria are responsible for the production of energy within the cell. It tends to read quite slowly. And so here's something that you can do. If you test yourself, so literally go and find something that you can read, and time yourself for a minute, read normally. Just read absolutely normally, and you'll actually hear that voice in your mind. Not everyone has it, but almost everyone has that voice, saying, the glorious, the mighty Titanic, the mitochondria are responsible for the production of energy within whatever is on the page. After a minute, put a dot to see how much you read, because that'll give you a baseline idea of what your current reading speed is. Average by the time you finish high school, it varies a lot, but the general average is about 250 words a minute, something between 200 and 300 words a minute. So put a dot at the end of the minute so you can say that is how much I read. Then try this. Use a finger and push that voice to jog, not to sprint, just to jog. Now read from the very next line or the very next section. Don't repeat the exact same stuff, because otherwise, of course, you're going to read quicker because then you know what's coming. But you take that finger and now you make it go, the mitochondria are responsible for the production of energy within the cell. It doesn't have to sprint, but it's got to jog. Time yourself for a minute and compare and contrast the speed. Now, I'll tell you, on average, people increase by approximately 1/3, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but the average increase is about 1/3 faster by the time you use the finger just to make that little voice speak quicker. So that's nothing special at all. That's definitely not speed reading, and it's not even what I call quick reading. Quick reading, which I sometimes call speed reading light or the free app, is the next bit of advice which I've got for you. But all I've done so far with that finger, make the voice jog, you can call that quicker reading. There's nothing weird about that whatsoever. Quick reading, however, gets a little bit stranger, because what quick reading is using that finger, you make the voice jog, and now the voice is jogging really quickly, and now it's sprinting, and now it couldn't go any faster, it's going as fast as it possibly, it's going as quickly as it possibly can. You deliberately push the finger slightly quicker so that it cannot say every word anymore. It's literally impossible for it to say every word, because when it can't say every word, what does the brain instantly do? It says, oh, you're wanting me to filter the information. You're wanting me to perform closure. You're wanting me to compress the data to the key idea. And it instantly starts to kill very predictable words. The most obvious predictable words are articles like and, the. If you go quickly enough that you give your brain permission to ignore the and, the, which it actually wants to. It doesn't want that junk. That's like noticing every eyelash or every hair. The moment that you do that, you will get significantly faster. So literally with the finger, push yourself so fast that some of the words die. but slowly enough that you know what's going on. And time yourself for a minute in that same text. If you compare your normal reading speed, that was before you used a finger at all, to that quick reading speed where you're allowing your brain to kill a word or two, the average increase in speed is approximately 2/3. In other words, if you were reading 250 words a minute to start out with, it's quite likely that you're pushing about 400 words a minute, literally just by using a finger and giving your brain permission to kill a few silly words. Now, full-on speed reading is in a completely different league. If you learn to full-on speed read, you can read thousands of words a minute, which you would have seen when I came and gave the presentation for you. But just use that for now as a means of going that much quicker. It's going to save you an awful lot of time. And of course, I hope plenty of you actually approach me so that you can learn to actually speed read, because that's when the real magic happens. One thing I should add at this point, which I never bring up in the original talks unless I have a lot of time, speed reading is not just about speed. There's a misunderstanding that speed reading is just about blitzing through the stuff quicker. It's not. Speed reading is about both speed and strategy. A strategy of how do I identify the most important information in a text? How can I be honest about what's less important and what's really important? And that's something which I can cover at some other stage. But for now, you can quick read. Allow yourself to go that much faster. Which brings up an obvious question, which might be in your head, which I'm going to start the next video with.